talking tonight about the, if I can pronounce it correctly, Antikythera machine. You've probably all heard about Ptolemy and his model of the solar system. It was a geocentric model. People thought that everything revolved around the Earth. And in order to make that match the actual motions of the planets against the stars in the sky, they had to come up with models that involved not just circles, but circles within circles, called epicycles. And it became a very complicated model, but the interesting thing about it was that it was actually very accurate. And I've heard that modern planetariums, when they're doing a projection of the planet motions on the sky, it actually works out that it's easier to do that using a geocentric model. So it's not really something that we can say is wrong. It's just a different way of looking at the planetary motions. Now, Copernicus, as you probably also have heard, came up with a different idea for representing the planetary motions, a heliocentric model in which the planets revolve around the sun rather than the Earth. Now, this certainly had a lot of advantages in terms of simplifying the motions, but unfortunately, Copernicus was still married to the idea of perfect circles, perfection in heaven, and all this kind of thing. And so it wasn't any better, it wasn't any more accurate in showing the motions of the planets in the sky against reality. And he actually came up with some epicycles and some other complications of the model to try and make it all match the real motions. So many people rejected Copernicus's ideas at first because it really didn't seem to be any better model of the solar system. It wasn't until Kepler came along and introduced the idea of elliptical orbits, in which the planets don't even move at a uniform speed, rotational speed. They actually change their speed. When they're closer to the sun, they move faster. When they're farther from the sun, they move slower. And that finally did make a better and more improved accuracy in the model of our solar system. Now, this kind of thing is what I used to teach my students in high school. When we started getting into the idea of gravitation, I would do a kind of historical review of the models of the solar system. And frankly, it always bothered me. I wasn't really sure how these epicycles could actually simulate the performance of an elliptical orbit and non-uniform motion. I could say it, I could read it in the book, and I could see all these, static diagrams on the paper. It just really didn't make sense to me. And the other thing that confused me was, when they did have all of these epicycles and confusion of circles within circles, how did they calculate all of these things without any modern computers? Well, I got the answer to these questions this summer, last summer, when I visited Greece. And my family and I went to a number of places around Athens and that big island, the Peloponnese. But the most fascinating thing for me was seeing the museum displays about something that was discovered near that little island of Antikythera, just near in between the Peloponnese and Crete. So what actually happened here was that there was a shipwreck. About 70 BC, there was a ship that smashed into this island, and the ship stayed down there for 2,000 years, and in 1900, some sponge fishers actually started finding some pieces of things down below. And they reported it, and the archaeologists came along and they dove for the pieces, and they started bringing up some amazing things. This was apparently a treasure ship that had been sunk, and there were a lot of things that were completely unique to this particular wreck. And amongst the salvage were these little pieces. They're about the size of the palm of my hand. They're not very big. They were heavily corroded, but they seem to show some very, very interesting markings on them, and some wheels. And it was obviously something different that hadn't been found in these kind of shipwrecks before. But the archaeologists were rather puzzled by it, and because it was so heavily corroded, it wasn't for another 50 years before it was finally cleaned up enough to actually figure out what was going on. So I did find an article in the Scientific American, June 1959, when they finally come to the point where they could see a little bit more of the detail. So this is now a diagram of the cleaned pieces of bronze that they have found. And they found that there were gears as well as these wheels. And they could actually see and count the number of teeth on the gears. And it started to become obvious that this had been a computer, a mechanical computer for calculating these cycles and epicycles, and it could be used to actually predict the positions of the moon around the Earth and the other planets in the solar system, and predict where they were going to appear in the sky at different calendar dates. They even managed to look at the settings and the markings on them and figured out fairly accurately that this device had last been used in the year 82 BC. That's what the date settings corresponded to in our modern terminology. So it matched fairly closely with the sort of guessed date of the wreck of 70 BC. So fairly close matchup there. Now they could look at the cleaned up pieces, and they could figure out some of the gear ratios that were going on here. So they could also see that it wasn't completely perfect either. They looked at some of the markings and found that they weren't exactly right, and it also had been repaired. There were some signs that some of the gears had broken at one point and had actually been fixed. Now, one example of the cycles that were built into this computer was something called, and I'm going to mess up the name of this one, Exeligmos cycle. You may have heard of something called the Saros cycle, which is a kind of repetition of eclipses of the sun and the moon. And that repeats, but not in the same place. So after one Saros cycle, there's a repetition of eclipses, but the eclipses don't occur in the same geographical location. They're actually shifted by about 120 degrees of longitude. The Exeligmos cycle is 3 times the Saros in length, and that is the cycle that comes around and makes the eclipse happen at the same geographical location, almost exactly. And that cycle takes exactly 19,756 days. Not exactly. To our best knowledge right now, it's 19,755.96, which means the geographic location would be, again, shifted a little bit, but very, very close. And by looking at the gears in this machine, they actually found out that they had put in a gear ratio that matched this cycle with this kind of precision. So it really showed not only did they have the technology and the design capability of putting gear ratios like this, but they also knew about this 54-year cycle, and so must have had a long history of collecting astronomical observations of eclipses in order to recognize that this cycle was taking place. Now, in our current century, we've actually managed to come up with better ways of examining these heavily corroded pieces of bronze and using CT scans, which is a kind of an X-ray from different directions, so they can actually look at layers throughout the machine and see different pieces of the gears, which are all kind of smushed on top of each other. They can separate them out and again count the teeth, look at the gear connections and so on. So they've been able to figure out a lot more about the device. So now we can actually build reproductions of the device, and many people have done this and have learned a lot in that process of recreating the gear mechanisms and so on. I was quite amazed. I'm a Lego fan, and I was really impressed by the people who actually built one of these machines out of Lego. A lot of stuff online available about this if you're interested in it. I've also written an article for astronauts, and so you can find the links to various websites in there. One of them is the actual research site that's still ongoing, and they have a video, this is just one frame out of the video, showing the layers through the device as they can reconstruct it using these CT scans. So you can see now some of the actual gears here and how they're meshing together, and gears on top of other gears so that one is interacting here but the other one is interacting with a secondary one and so on. And this is how they can actually reconstruct what all of the gear ratios were and how fast each wheel would have been turning relative to the others, and calculating the various orbits and movements of the planets. So it is getting really, really complicated. One thing that I was very particularly interested in was this non-uniform motion. So let's just look at the lunar motion, the moon going around the Earth. It's in an orbit, fairly close to circular, but not exactly circular. And we hear a lot in the news these days about supermoons, you know, the full moon that's going to be closest to the Earth because of the elliptical orbit, and so it's going to look bigger there. Well, it doesn't look very much bigger. If you actually go out on the night of a supermoon and look up, now it's a full moon. You go out on a night when it's not a supermoon, it's a full moon, it looks just about the same. There's really not a lot of visual difference between the size of the moon because of its elliptical orbit. However, it does make a difference in terms of the orbital speed. It's not moving at a constant rate. Now, if you're a really avid moon watcher, you'll note this has the effect of this libration of the moon. It seems to wobble back and forth because its rotational motion doesn't match the orbital motion around the Earth, not exactly. So these things were easily observable by the ancient Greeks. They knew that the moon was not orbiting the Earth at a constant speed, and this machine had to simulate that. So they actually did build a mechanism to make the moon pointer on this mechanism move at a non-constant rate. And it was kind of interesting that they could do this using a set of two gears that were not meshing with each other, but they were interacting through a pin sticking up through a slot in one of the other gears. And so it was not pushing it around at a constant rate, it was pushing it around sometimes at a big radius, and slower, and sometimes at a small radius, and faster. I was really, really happy to find I could buy one of these. I picked up a souvenir. I have it with me if anybody wants to have a closer look and a hands-on look at it. I'll stick around after the meeting for a little while. But this was the loveliest souvenir I picked up, and it shows two moons for illustration purposes. The real machine would have only shown one, but this one has a darker tarnished moon on a smaller gear underneath here. That's moving at a constant rotational speed. But it's interacting with a small gear here, which has a pin into a slot in the larger gear. So as I was saying, it pushes it slower when it's out at a big radius and faster when it's in a smaller radius. And so that interacts with the upper gear on this one, which is connected to the pointer. And so this moon sometimes goes faster than this one and sometimes goes slower. So can we have the video?
Click it again, Richard.
There we go. So watch the different pace of those two moons. So I've been spending many hours looking at this thing and playing around with it and trying to figure out exactly how it works. And it's a really very tricky little bit of mechanics down here in this corner, because you've got a gear rotating on a disc with a pin on the gear. So it only makes sense if you really get your hands on it, take a close look, and play it around back and forth. I did put this video as a YouTube video now, so I put the link to my article in the Astronauts if you want to look at it that way as well. What this little souvenir model doesn't show is that there is yet another effect that takes place. The elliptical orbit of the moon doesn't stay in the same place all the time. It precesses. It's actually pulled and shifted around so that the time of the fastest speed and the slowest speed, the apogee and the perigee, don't happen exactly at the same interval all the time. The Greeks knew about this too, and they built it into their model. So this is just a photograph from the museum showing one of the reconstructed models. That is the portion that I bought as the souvenir, but it's all sitting on this big rotating platform, which moves very slowly and shifts the position of the perigee and apogee to match the reality. So this one find, this one archaeological artifact, really has a lot of interesting implications about the history. As I say, they must have had an enormous collection of astronomical observations and records in order to work out all of these cycles and know exactly what the number of days between a repeat would be, so that they could build it into this machine. They must have had some pretty good math and geometry and understanding of gear ratios to translate those calculations into a mechanical calculator. And they must have had a pretty intensive infrastructure of people making bronze, working with bronze, making gears, making the tools that are necessary to work the bronze. And this is something that comes out in some of the modern recreations of this. You can do it easily using modern equipment, but how did they do it using the equipment that was available at the time? And people who actually tried to recreate all of this, and it's very, very complicated. However, von Daniken in 1968 wrote a book about Chariots of the Gods, and he claimed that this machine was evidence that the Earth had been visited by extraterrestrials with great advancement, and they'd given humanity their technology. No. There's really not that much evidence of a extraordinarily high technology. There's mistakes in there. It's obviously the work of humans. For one thing, all of the gears had triangular teeth. And if any of you know anything about real gears these days, the teeth are not triangular. It's not the best method of making the energy transfer from one gear to another. It causes some play, some errors in the motion, and it causes friction and breakage in some cases. So it's really not the best kind of thing. In fact, one person had worked out that the meshing errors in the gears would create errors in the eventual output that would be greater than some of the calculations that had gone into the gear ratios. So although it was a fascinating device and could do an awful lot of stuff, it had its bugs. The markings on the scales had obviously been done by hand. And again, if you look at them very closely and compare them with an accurate scale, there are errors up to about 0.4 of a degree, which is pretty good, but still it's not as good as the astronomical records they had. And the bronze was not the best material. It was brittle. It did resist corrosion to some extent, but over 2,000 years, not enough. But it was so brittle that some of the pieces had actually had to be patched after the fact, and there's evidence in the CT scans that some of the pieces had been patched. So that also means it had been in active use. It was being used, it was used enough that it got broken, and then somebody had to go in and understand it well enough to fix it as well. So what happened to all of that? Unfortunately, cannons. And we heard about this in many of the museums as well. They were lamenting the fact that they knew that there had been bronze artifacts, statues in particular, and they were no longer around. They only had copies, reproductions in stone. And they said what happened to a lot of the bronze was cannons. It was a valuable material, it made very strong cannons, and the war effort always took precedence over everything else. So probably there were other machines like this and they got melted down. The bronze also corrodes. Again, many of the museum displays showed artifacts that obviously had bronze things on them, and it was all just a green smudge. But what happened to the knowledge? How come we didn't make progress from there? Well, unfortunately, again, wars, religion, people not wanting to have documents that contradicted their current beliefs, books got burnt, devices were destroyed, art was destroyed. And a lot of it just was no longer available. Now, as astronomers, you've probably seen some of the results of the one place that didn't have so much of the Dark Ages, and that's the Arabic world. A lot of the astronomical knowledge got passed on into the Middle East, and the astronomers in that area added a lot more information, and a lot of our star names are in Arabic. Some of the complicated mechanisms and the technology of clockmaking was also passed on into the Middle East. For example, this is an Arabic copy of Archimedes' book about the construction of water clocks. And there is some evidence of various clocks of different kinds being built throughout the Middle East during the period where in Europe, nobody was building anything like this at all. So now, as I say, people have been able to understand the machine well enough, and we do have the ability to rebuild this machine. And this is approximately what it would have looked like. It was in a wooden box. It had these bronze plates with markings around on the dial and needles showing direction. We don't know exactly how the planets were shown. There was another display in the museum speculatively showing how the planets might have appeared on a different scale. So people are still working on this as a research project ongoing. We're still trying to figure out things that might have been missing and can we reconstruct it from what's still there. So it's a fascinating story, a fascinating device, and I certainly highly recommend it if you're in Greece, in Athens. There are 2 museums that are full of displays about this kind of mechanism. This is not so great for use on the screen, but as I say, if you look in Astronauts, I do have links to other places where you can get more information. Well, thank you very much.